Welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about how scientific literature gets published. We're going to start with the idea, move through implementation into curriculum, into practice, and so forth. This little flowchart here, this is essentially how scientific papers, how an idea gets published, how it gets implemented into practice, right? The full A to B, right? A to Q or something. You know, this is how it gets done. Science must begin with myth and the criticism of myth. It's a quote by Karl Popper. Everything has always been abstract before it's been concrete. You know, the real true concreteness is out there. However, our thoughts don't always represent what is out there, right? That is the huge discrepancy, right? Are our thoughts accurate enough to even fathom what is out there, right? And I think we do a pretty good job, but definitions are important, right? I think that's foundational. We need to study language and understand language. This is something that I'm constantly doing. I actually went to school in French. I did my grade 1 through 12 in French, and French is my first language. So, you know, I'm still working on syntax, on grammar, on learning the words and the vocabulary. You know, it's something that I didn't study throughout my life, and I'm kind of catching up on now. But I think that's really important, right? But I digress. An idea. Science starts with an idea. Of course, the idea must be reasonable, right? Should be logical, should be rational, right? Rationality we've been talking about on Instagram a little bit, and I think it's important to distinguish that it's not useless, right? Implementation of people's morals and values is important. Now, does it always align with objective truth? Maybe not, but subjective truth is an important concept as well. I don't want to diminish someone for thinking rationally over logically, right? Logic is a part of rational thinking. However, rational thinking, right, reasonable thinking does rely on more than just logic. Now, if we're talking about objective truth, we must remain with an objective means of looking at it, right? Philosophy, right? This is where philosophy shines. In the idea stage, in the thinking stage. You know, an idea should be able to face philosophical scrutiny before we even try to test and see if it's true or cause and effects and all this, right? It's got to face a philosophical discussion. I think that's very important, right? Any action, anything that happens in the world was a sustained thought before it came to be, right? And that's something that's true in all of life, not just scientific, the method, right? And we have epidemiology. This is the modern day front runner of the scientific literature. It's important to note that nothing should ever be concluded from epidemiological studies, right? If you're taking epidemiology as a fact, you're so far away from the scientific method, it's not even funny, right? We often take epidemiology at face value, and this is absolutely absurd. Epidemiology, the whole point of it is to generate hypotheses, right? That's the whole point of epidemiology. You're looking at correlation. We know that correlation isn't causation. Somehow we still take epidemiology at face value. It's funny, the whole germ theory is based pretty much solely on epidemiology. The whole idea of contagion is based solely on epidemiology. Any sort of randomized controlled trial, anytime that it's been in a controlled manner to try and mimic natural transmissions, you know, it falls short, right? So we rely on epidemiology for the entire notion of contagion, which is foolish in my mind. But I digress. We're going to get back to the topic at hand. This is essentially the start of science. This is the start of learning, of observing. It's an idea, right? We're thinking individuals, right? We try to rationalize and, you know, understand and explain everything. It is funny in a way, right, when you think about it, but everything does start with an idea, and we should think about this idea for a long time. We should meditate on this idea, right? It's something that we don't do anymore, right? Results are always drawn before an experiment is conducted at this point, before something is even observed. right? We want the results for this, the vested interest. We talked about this in the last video. I really strongly urge you to go check that video out where we go over the components of scientific papers. This is going to be more abstract. It's going to be a larger picture, but yeah, it starts with an idea. Next, of course, we have the hypothesis. An important part of scientific method, scientific study, of scientific papers, of science. The hypothesis is very important, right? We draw this from an idea. We draw it from epidemiological studies where we see correlation. We think, okay, let's test this causation. You know, there are many aspects to a good hypothesis, which we'll go over here. Okay, a good hypothesis predicts the relationship between variables, right? This is a fundamental part of a hypothesis, right? You're trying to write an if-then statement. So essentially the hypothesis is trying to formulate, I suppose, a sentence that predicts that relationship, right? You know, if a germ is introduced to an individual, then they will become sick. Would be a hypothesis for the germ theory, right? Falsifiability, of course, fundamental to the hypothesis. Again, it should be a statement that is able to be proven false. You can't have a hypothesis that is not able to be proven false, right? That's the point. You want to try and prove your hypothesis false, and the harder you try to do that, and the more it stands up to that scrutiny, the more true it's going to be. Of course, the hypothesis should be simple and concise. There should be no ambiguity here. It should be very straightforward. There should be no interpretation. There should be no trying to decipher what the hypothesis means, essentially. It should be very, very straightforward and clear, and it should be a clear sentence we mentioned in the introduction. A good hypothesis, of course, should be testable, right? You should be able to conduct an experiment to test if your hypothesis is true or not. It's important to note here that a hypothesis can be tested through experimentation or observation as well, right? Observation is a very key part of science, a lost part of science that was diminished by the Flexner report. If we go back and listen to, in my episode 2 of my podcast, we talk about the Flexner report and how he mentioned that observation is an incomplete way to conduct science, right? Which is totally false in my opinion. Of course, we could have a large debate on this. This is something we'll talk about in the future. I do think observation is complete, especially observation in a purely natural environment, right? And what effect does the conscious observer have on that is another question, maybe leaning towards the quantum realm, but you know, it's regardless, observation is something that we can do, right? We can give somebody a substance and see what happens. We can observe their blood, we can observe their markers. You know, there's ways to go about it, not that I always agree with those, but observation is a foundational part, and you can test the hypothesis through observation. You could test it through experimentation. There are different methods of approaching it. A hypothesis, of course, needs to address the research question, right? If the hypothesis doesn't address the research question, it's an absolutely useless hypothesis, right? It needs to be concise throughout the paper, right? If the research question is, do germs cause disease? And your hypothesis is, if we introduce a germ and then the individual gets sick, you know, that's a good hypothesis for the question at hand, right? But if the question is, do germs cause disease? And we say, if we introduce a culture of bacteria in which the culture contains a plethora of other chemicals, then the individual gets sick. Well, you can't really decipher whether or not that research question was addressed, because you know that in that culture there's a whole different amount of chemicals there, right? So you're not actually, one, accounting for all the independent variables, which we'll discuss here in a moment, but the you know, obviously they're not going to write the hypothesis in that way either, right? I think I might have set that one up a little bit, but you know, that's the case, right? So the hypothesis it needs to align with the research question, you know, it needs to align with the methods, it needs to align, right? There needs to be alignment within a paper, right? This is what doesn't occur, right? When the research question and the hypothesis and the methods section all don't align with each other, right? That's where you're going to have problems, right? Because then the discussion, of course, is going to be all flawed, because they're going to address the research question, you know, with the results from the methods section that makes no sense for the hypothesis or the research question at hand, right? So it all needs to align. And when you're reading scientific papers, there needs to be alignment. That is a foundational aspect, right? Alignment in a paper is something that we don't see very often anymore. Lastly, of course, we have the independent and dependent variables. You know, a hypothesis should account for the independent and dependent variables. I suppose I should expand on this a little bit here. Okay, so the independent variable is the part of the hypothesis that you expect to change the dependent variable, right? So let's use the example of the germ that I've been referencing here. The independent variable would be the germ itself. The dependent variable would be the health of the individual, right? Maybe classified by symptoms or presence of a fever or whatever it may be. However you want to define that, right? That's the important, right? It needs to be simple. It needs to be concise. It needs to be detailed. You know, that's something maybe I should have added in there. But essentially, the independent variable is what is changing the dependent variable, right? So you need to account for the independent variable. You should try to isolate the independent variable. That's an important part of a hypothesis, of a scientific experiment, right? You want to isolate the independent variable. There shouldn't be other variables, right? These are called co-founding factors, co-founding variables. And a good scientific study aims at eliminating that, right? So you're actually trying to isolate the independent variable. So you know that in your study, the independent variable that you introduce is the sole contributing factor to what's changing the dependent variable, right? A good hypothesis obviously is detailed enough to explain this, right? If you're going to introduce a germ to an individual, an isolation of germs, an isolation of bacteria, you give that to an individual, they should have the symptom profile at hand, right? That should be included in the hypothesis. You should describe what the symptom profile should be, right? If you look at Koch's postulates, these are honestly a beautiful set of postulates that are almost a hypothesis in a way, right? This set of postulates absolutely makes a great case for a germ being the cause of a disease, right? If the methods lines up perfectly with the Koch's postulates, that would be absolutely overwhelming proof in my mind that germs are a contributing factor to disease, right? If they are a causal factor to disease. However, this has never been done, obviously, in scientific literature, which is why we don't subscribe to that sort of ideology. But a good hypothesis, of course, you got to account for the independent and the dependent variables, right? You're trying to address these in the hypothesis. You're trying to make them clear, trying to make them detailed enough for the reader to be able to understand it, for it to be clear enough for the purpose of discussion. So, a very important part of the hypothesis. All of this, the hypothesis is really central. I know we spent a lot of time here, but it's really, really central. You really want to understand this. Understanding a good hypothesis. Alignment is everything. Alignment is absolutely everything, right? You want to make sure that you're aligned, that everything in the study is aligned with what you're talking about, with the methods, with the discussion, with the results, with the introduction even. You know, the introduction may be the most useless part. You know, it should give us a good historical background, which I do think is useful in a way, but you know, when you're assessing the study, maybe it's not the most useful part, but the hypothesis is in the introduction, right? So that's the important part to assess and address, right? And just for the purpose of the Blackboard's completion, the hypothesis should be an if-then statement, and it should be aligned with the entire paper, right? You know, this is so important. I cannot stress this enough. If-then statement's important, right? But it's got to include all of this, right? So look at the hypothesis, assess the hypothesis, assess the alignment. That's what I'm going to be hounding on, is the alignment of the hypothesis within the paper itself, within the discussion itself, right? So this is the hypothesis. We'll move on here now. All right, next we're going to be talking about the proposal. This is a fundamental part of science, of conducting science, right? Because you know what you need in science? You need money. Right? You need money in science, right? It's very expensive to run experiments, especially if you're really accounting for the co-founding variables. If you're really doing scrutinous work, running a study is very difficult, very expensive. Maybe not difficult, but very expensive. You know, if you're running experiments, running a lab, you know, that's very expensive work, right? So money's a big thing. So the proposal, you need to propose your idea. You have your idea, you have your hypothesis, you're going to make a presentation, essentially. You're going to propose to you know, try and get some funding, right? Funding is fundamental. That's it. This is essentially the sole purpose of a proposal, right? Because if you could have an idea, generate a hypothesis, and just test it, right? You wouldn't need to do a proposal. So this is all about money. You're looking for grants. You know, this is one of the problems in science in my mind again, right? Because, you know, back in the day, funny enough, they used to pick a scientist and they would give that scientist funding, right? They'd pick a scientist like Louis Pasteur or even Antoine Béchamp. They'd say, you're a great scientist. Here's a salary. I want you to conduct science as you see fit. You're going to write papers. You're going to do all this stuff, right? Obviously, there's less room for vested interests. Obviously, there was still room for vested interest. I think this was a better way to conduct science. It's not going to work nowadays. Of course, there's not enough money in the world to fund every scientist out there. You know, if we pick the best ones, perhaps, how do you pick the best ones? Who's picking the best ones is going to be problematic again. This is going to be where you're going to see vested interest in the funding, necessarily in the proposal, but yeah, the proposal itself, you know, is the aspect where you're trying to get money. That's essentially it. Okay, so I'm not going to go over the components of a proposal. Maybe we'll do a video on that in the future if you guys want that. It's basically just a presentation, you know, of your idea, of your hypothesis, of your, essentially you're going to write out your study and present your study as if it's already done, right? This is what we should find. This is how we're going to run the study. These are the components, these are the materials we need. This is how much money we need. This is the timeline of the study. In essence, that's what a proposal is. But we need money, right? So we need grants. And so where do we get these grants? We get it from the government. Obviously, there's private funders and there's institutions, right? Like universities. Now, the government's not going to help us out here in the terrain world, obviously, nor are institutions, because we go against their agendas and their dogmatic ways of thinking. So private funding is really the way to go for our community. I know Gerald Pollack's lab is privately funded, but you know that's a lab that's running $1 million a year, right? So it's a very expensive thing to run, right? So private's where it's at. That's why money's important. That's why I don't shy away from making a dollar. Not like I make much money right now anyways. But anyways, I digress. You know, the governments aren't going to help us. Obviously, they have their vested interest. Pharmaceutical companies are funding the government, and obviously this falls under the universities too. And you know, pharmaceutical companies fund a lot of research as well, right? Supplement companies fund a lot of research, right? They want research on their products, right? If they're gonna, you know, I got a friend that does research there in Toronto, and it's funded by a supplement company, right? I'm sure the supplement company wants to sell what's being researched. There's no other reason why they would do that study, right? They want studies to back up what they're doing. You know, if the results don't necessarily meet the criteria of the supplement company, well, do you think that paper is going to get published? Or do you think they'll just try again? You know, for the sake of my friend, I really hope that he gets the results that he wants or he'll be out of a job, right? That's how it works. That's how it works. You know, so it's all intertwined. Government institutions, universities, you know, pharmaceutical companies, supplement companies, medical industry, it's all very intertwined. The only real way to get a lack of vested interest is through a true grant, through a true private funding. You know, here's this set amount of money, go and do what you please with it. Obviously, the individual can still have vested interests. You know, fundamentally, it's hard to avoid, right? Everybody has a kind of a way that they're leaning in their thinking as well. That's why it's important to be able to assess scientific papers. All right, you got your grant. Set up you should already have your methods section written out, right? You should already have your methods section written out. You obviously already have the results that you would like to get from your study, which is the reason why you got the grant, right? The results should line up with the interests of those granting the money, right? I'm going to do an experiment showing that your pharmaceutical drug works. Great, here's the money. All right, I'm going to run an experiment showing that your pharmaceutical drug doesn't work. Well, tell me if the pharmaceutical company is going to give you that money, right? Definitely not. So you should have the methods, you have your expected results, right? You're wanting to meet those results. Obviously, this is a problem. This is where you're going to conduct your study, right? This is the important aspect of this. So you run your study, and then you get into data analysis. you're kind of moving from experimentation down to data analysis, right? So you got your results. Blind data analysis is the best, of course. This doesn't always happen. Triple blind studies where the experimenters, the participants, and the data analysts, are all blind to the parameters of the study. A double blind is where only the experimentation is blind, right? But we know we can lie with statistics. We mentioned this before. I'm going to go over this more in depth moving forward. We know we can manipulate the statistics. We can manipulate the data, what you decide to omit, right? You can fit it using different confidence intervals. You can remove different outliers to fit the data. Obviously you could be fraudulent and just omit any data that you'd like, right? So the data analysis part is fundamental, of course. This is where you're getting the results of your study. Then you obviously move down into writing your paper. And obviously, we went over this in the last video, the IMRAD format. You write your introduction, you do a little more research, right? You write your methods section, which you should already have written out. Your results section, which you've already expected. Now, do those results meet what you expected? Did your hypothesis stand up to the test that you ran? You write your discussion, you have your references, and there you go, you have your paper. So this is kind of the middle stages, right? You have your idea, your hypothesis, you get your money. You need your money to do science, right? This is how science works nowadays. You run your experiment, you analyze the data, you write your paper, right? Now to where do we go? So obviously now we're at a point where you want to get your paper published, right? We're at the publishing part. Now, it's really important here when you're publishing the paper, right? Which journal are you getting published in, right? Different journals have different requirements. Obviously, it costs money to publish, costs money to apply to get published. This is where the peer review process fits in. So we're going to break this down a little bit further. It depends on the journal. That's what I'll say. It depends on the journal. Obviously, there are better, more independent journals than others, right? You have journals with vested interests, of course. We talked about Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who monopolized the publishing industry back in the 1900s there, in the late 1900s kind of, and obviously that was problematic. It's changed hands, but a lot of vested interest comes in here, right? They're not going to publish any anti-germ theory ideas in there, anti-vitamin theories. So you got to look at where you're reading your paper. Not to say that all papers that are published in Nature are bad, or all papers that are published on the NCBI are bad. This is not what I'm saying at all, right? There are great papers that get published. Obviously, if they have neutral, negative results, this makes it more credible and honest. But yeah, let's break this down a little bit further here. Okay, so journal guidelines, of course. Something may include, scientists must ground their research in, up-to-date, peer-reviewed literature, right? So there may be required numbers of references. They'll obviously be checking the references. But various journal guidelines for different journals, right? It depends. New England Journal of Medicine or Science or Nature, whatever. It depends on the journal, right? So this you can kind of look up to yourself, and we won't go over it all here. It's just important to note that obviously there are journal guidelines for papers, which is understandable, absolutely understandable. And the problem doesn't necessarily lie here, right? The guidelines are pretty much, should be good science, right? It should be a good scientific paper. The problem actually come during the peer review process. And we've talked about this a little bit. Obviously, the peer review process is a large echo chamber. A bunch of people think the same thing, assessing papers, making sure that what the papers are saying fits with what they're thinking. The problem here is ego. The problem here is inflated ego, I suppose I should say. Obviously people don't want to be challenged on their beliefs. They don't want to be challenged on their scientific ideas. Again, this is understandable. Your life's work goes into something. Some young fella comes along and dismantles the entire thing. They're not going to like that, right? But this is what science is, right? This is what science is. There's no way around it. The peer review process is pretty garbage, right? The journals often are the ones that are doing the peer reviewing, so they have their committee, right? Obviously, there should be no relationships between the authors and the peer reviewers, right? This is up to the peer reviewers' discretion to highlight these. So that's another thing that you should note, right? So, theoretically, the peer review process should address the validity. It should assess the significance and the originality of the paper, right? Obviously, no plagiarism. And this is great, right? The validity of the study as well, the significance of the study. This is probably the worst area, right? Is it significant in the research nowadays? Is it significant to my thinking and my theory and this dogma that we all think is correct for some reason because the majority thinks it or authority figures think it, right? I think that's probably the most problematic point. The validity of study is good. Again, are we actually addressing the validity of the study, right? Does everything align in the study? A lot of papers get by that have no alignment in the study, right? The research question, the hypothesis, the method section, and the results and the discussion all don't align. They all don't align with each other. They all don't make sense, right? What we're talking about makes absolutely no sense. So this is important. This is essentially what the peer review process looks for, what they should do. Does it always happen? That's up to you to decide, I suppose. And of course, if it all goes well, your paper gets published. And it's important to note, when your paper does get published, it gets published in the literature, it gets published in a journal, right? People don't necessarily read that literature right away, right? It takes time to get implemented into curriculum, into textbooks, into what a professor teaches, what a practitioner utilizes. So that's what we'll discuss here soon. But really it's important that just because a scientific paper gets published doesn't mean it gets actually implemented into the current scientific consensus, right? This is a long process, right? It could take years and years before it's significant enough, right? Often people assess papers based on the number of citations that their paper has, right? So this paper's been cited by 1,000 people. Oh, well, this must be a good paper, right? Well, you can't base... It would be illogical to think like that, right? You can't base your opinion based on the popularity of the paper. You should base it on the actual components of the paper. Now, papers that have been cited that many times are a great one to go in and to assess, right? And see how good it is. Because just because it's popular doesn't mean that it's actually aligned. It doesn't mean that it's actually good science. So that's something that we'll look at. We'll go over some examples down the road here. And, it's important to know that, right? It's important to know that just because something gets published doesn't mean it actually gets implemented into the scientific consensus. It depends, especially where it gets published. People, trust more prestigious journals. They trust Nature more so than maybe an independent journal, right? So, I think that's something important to consider, right? Just because it gets published doesn't mean it gets implemented in the literature, right? So, implemented into the scientific consensus. So obviously, a practitioner, a professor could read your paper, implement it into their work. That would be very helpful. That would be very good on the individual. I think a good practitioner and a good professor should be well versed in the literature, should be reading and actually assessing the literature. Is that always the case? Not necessarily. Professors often just teach from the textbook. Practitioners often just go what they're taught in med school. Obviously, it takes a long time for something to get implemented into a curriculum. It takes a long time for it to get implemented into a textbook. Years and years later, a study might get implemented into a textbook. And truly, it's mostly by chance. And if your paper is popular, right, a lot of it is a popularity contest. Papers at the bottom of Google Scholar aren't getting as much traction as the ones that have 1,000 citations, right? Those kind of get pushed up a little higher. We all know how Google works. Google Scholar is not much different. Great place to look for papers, but you got to be flicking through the pages too. You got to be assessing the papers essentially. Okay, we'll talk about textbooks. How does literature get published in textbooks? The creation of a textbook obviously is a huge job, right? Textbooks are very large. They're very large compilations of the literature. Obviously, a lot of money is needed to fund the creation of a textbook, which may be problematic in itself with the vested interest. Where is the money coming from? It's important to note that a textbook doesn't have to include all of the scientific literature. I'm sure there's a bias towards positive literature. There's obviously a bias towards the scientific consensus. That's quite obvious, which is not necessarily absurd either. Textbooks should adhere to the scientific consensus, I suppose. Whether the scientific consensus is correct doesn't necessarily mean anything to those writing the textbook, right? The textbook's not going to come out of left field and start talking about the terrain model of health in a microbiology textbook, right? You think that would go well? You think the funders would like that? Professors wouldn't like that. Universities wouldn't like that. Government wouldn't like that. That's something that you should keep in mind, right? Like, so it does need to abide by the scientific consensus. So that's an important point here, right? The textbook does need to abide by the scientific consensus. And that's not absurd, right? Like this is what I'm saying. It's not absurd, right? But okay, so fundamentally, right, the textbooks rely on the scientific consensus, right? This is fundamental. This is not absurd. This is what it is. This is what a textbook is. The textbook is the scientific consensus. Okay, textbooks are obviously a synthesis of the primary literature. I think it's important to note here too that, you know, universities in my university career, it's not appropriate to cite out of a textbook, right? That's something that's important to note, which is interesting because their entire course is based on a textbook. They don't base it off primary literature themselves. They base it on the secondary literature, right? So primary literature would be, you know, published papers in journals. Textbook would be considered a secondary source, a secondary piece of literature. You know, and that obviously has never made sense to me. But this is what a textbook is, right? Like a textbook is a great way to understand the scientific consensus. It's a great way to understand the general idea in the literature, right? So it all needs to fit in this scientific consensus. There obviously is a little bit of bias and speak and text beyond what is the literature, right? People are inferring in textbooks, right? That's why it's a secondary source. But all of the university curriculums are based on textbooks. You know, there's so many levels of subjectivity that get added in. There's so many levels of vested interest that get added in, right? It's not just one, it's not just at the proposal, it's not just at the funding. It's at the level of the publishing. It's implementation of the literature into textbooks. It's which textbooks get selected for which curriculum. There are many levels to this. You know, I like to say that a textbook is like a snapshot of the current scientific consensus. If you want to get a good idea of what the current scientific consensus is, you read a textbook. All right, and we'll group these in together. We'll talk about the curriculum, right? Obviously based on textbooks. We touched on it there briefly, but obviously a textbook gets selected. So there's many levels of vested interest here. I want to state that again. The curriculum, again, is a snapshot of the scientific consensus. That's important to note as well. That's what you're learning in university. You're learning the scientific consensus. You're not learning necessarily how to assess scientific literature, just like you don't learn how to think in primary school. You know, it's important to note when talking about curriculum, professors don't necessarily choose the textbooks, right? So it's not on the professors. The universities choose the textbooks, especially in science. Professors do, in some courses, have more freedom in choosing their textbooks. I've had professors that have created their textbooks before. And honestly, those were the absolute best classes that I've ever taken if the professor chose the textbook. And often when the professor chooses the textbook, right? If you're taking history, they're not choosing a textbook per se. They might choose a few pieces of literature, which they may have freedom with. You know, they may not. I'm not 100% sure there. I do know that professors, sometimes they have some say, sometimes they don't. I'm sure a professor can't pick some, you know, history of the terrain model, like maybe Pastel versus Bichon, or like any piece of literature like that. They're not going to pick, right? The university wouldn't like that. So obviously it does need to abide by the university's agenda, and that's an important point. You know, curriculum obviously has a lot to do with the university's agenda. It all has to fit into the university's agenda. Universities obviously get a lot of funding from various sources. Maybe it is all through benevolence, so they say. But it all depends on the agenda, right? Even if the professors do have freedom, it does need to, they're going to be audited. They're going to be surveilling what's happening in these classes. Students will also complain, right? Students want to go to learn the scientific consensus, right? This is why people go to university, to learn the scientific consensus. So, I think that's important to note, right? So this is kind of how it gets implemented into the curriculum. You can see that we're kind of getting away from actual primary literature because obviously somebody needs to teach the curriculum. Often professors will make a PowerPoint based on a textbook, right? So you're so far removed from the literature, you're 3-4 times removed from the primary literature. And then your professors tell you that if you're not choosing primary sources in your papers, right, it's not invalid, right? It's invalid. So what does that say about the validity of a university curriculum? It's all just based on the scientific consensus. Popularity doesn't mean it's correct. Authority doesn't mean it's correct. Expert opinion doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. These all indicate that they should be correct, but these are all logical fallacies at the same time, so you need to understand this, right? It's not that they're always incorrect, it's just that this opens up the door to a poor argument, right? Illogical thinking, right? That's important to understand. And of course, university students eventually hit the job market. How long does it take to be a doctor? 10 years by the time you're done residency. Likely longer now. I would say 12 years because you're not getting into a med school without a master's anymore. Trust me, you could be absolutely top of your class, and I know many people who've needed more than just an undergraduate degree, honors degree. Check all the boxes: volunteer, extracurricular, A+, 4.0, 4.3 GPAs. They're not getting into med school without a master's. So you're taking 10 to 12 years to get into practice, right? And that's in your first couple years as a doctor, as a practitioner. So you're 10 years removed, right? In a way, because eventually you stop actually learning from textbooks and the literature and you start just learning from practice, which is more appropriate in my mind. But the practice obviously builds upon older practice, which is all still based on the current scientific consensus, which is why the majority always reflects the scientific consensus. That's why the majority of healthcare is the current scientific consensus. This all makes sense. This all just makes sense in how it's conducted, right? It takes a long time for people to get in the job market. I think practitioners, like I said, practitioners and professors should stay up to date with the scientific literature. Absolutely. I think that's paramount. Do they do that? Maybe not. Is that their fault? I wouldn't say that it's their fault. They're so busy, right? Like professors and doctors are so extremely busy that they don't have time, right? They're worked to death. And it's even easier now than it was. When speaking to doctors who've been in the game for a long time, right? They were starting out working 80 hours a week. They don't have time to read the scientific literature. They're going to go off what they learned in med school. And obviously we know what was taught in med school. We know that it's all to do with scientific consensus. It's all based on vested interests and how curriculums were even monopolized by the Rockefellers. We talked about this again in episode 2 of my podcast there. That's obvious, right? There's a monopoly on curriculum, right? Universities aren't going to stray from the current scientific consensus. The current scientific consensus, of course, relies on a lot of invalid literature, and this is essentially what I'm trying to teach you guys. Assess the literature. Go to the literature. You want to go to the source, right? You don't attack the medical practice. Doctors are going to do their thing. People want doctors, right? This is what the people want. People want doctors. They want a magic pill. They want the magic bullets. Don't go and attack them. There's no point, right? There's no point at all in my mind. You want to get to the root. I'm all about root causes. You want to get to the root of it. Go assess the scientific literature. You want to be sure in what you're talking about. Go and assess the scientific literature. Don't go and talk and assess what a practitioner is doing. You're not even going to understand what the scientific literature is saying, right? You want to get to the root of it. And I think this is fundamentally important. We understand now how it manifests, how it gets out into practice, how it gets into curriculums, how it gets into textbooks, right? From an idea. That's important, but let's get to the root cause. This is what I'm trying to teach you. Assess the scientific literature. You want to think for yourself, right? You want to not have to go see a doctor. Nobody wants to go see a doctor, right? Maybe there are some people who like that. But, you You don't want to go do that, right? So you want to learn from the scientific literature itself. It's not through textbooks, and we'll assess textbooks. It's fun, right? We'll assess, like I always go back and assess what I learned in university, right? But you're so far removed from the literature, you want to really know something, go to the literature, right? And that can be complex because people use scientific terminology, and I'm going to slowly try and start teaching some of that as well. Scientific terminology is like another language, right? They use big words to try and steer the layman away, which I hate that word so much. Layman is such a bullshit word in my mind. Anybody can understand this. Anyone can apply the scientific method, right? If you have money. But, anybody can assess scientific literature. You can learn the terminology. It's another language, right? But you can learn it. Mike Donio does a great job. Science Defined. He's making it very accessible, right? Science should be simple and concise. That's what we're not seeing in the scientific literature. It's not simple. It's not concise. You should be able to explain the scientific literature. You should be able to explain these things to a 5-year-old, right? That's how you know that. I always assess somebody on their ability to discuss something, right, in a very simple way. You shouldn't have to use big long words to make yourself sound smart. I just don't think it's that useful. Obviously, it's not transparent. Maybe it is slightly more accurate, but at the same time, you can be accurate and simple at the same time. You can be concise and precise all at the same time. Obviously, this is a skill. This is something that you need to practice, but it's important, right? Especially if you're going to be an expert, if you're going to be an authority figure, it's important. Transparency is important, right? I certainly think so. The literature is not transparent. It is not transparent whatsoever. I think that's a major problem. Okay, I drew up a little flowchart here just to really simplify everything on a note of simplification. We start with an idea. Of course, everything starts with an idea, especially in science. Everything in life starts with an idea. I won't get too philosophical here. We move into generating a hypothesis, right? We need to generate a good hypothesis. We went over the components of a good hypothesis. I'm going to create another video of that clip of me talking about generating a hypothesis. I think it's very important to go over and over and over. This is a fundamental aspect of scientific papers. Next, we have the proposal, right? You generate your hypothesis, you have your results that you want to get, you generate a proposal because you need money to conduct an experiment. It's that simple. So you get your money, you run an experiment. You run your experiment, hopefully it aligns with your hypothesis, hopefully the methods is actually good. That's what I'm going to come through and assess, so it better be good. You got data analysis, right? Hopefully it's blind, likely it's not blind. It should be objective. Often it's not. Should be objective. You write your paper. Again, we went over the components of a scientific paper. Next, you got to get it published, right? More money, more vested interest here, peer review. Publishing includes the peer review process. You're moving into textbooks. Next, you move into the curriculum. Textbook is base of the curriculum, and eventually it all gets implemented into practice. Now, there is a way to get from publishing directly into practice if you have a good practitioner, if you have a good professor, right? If you have a good scientist. There should be a direct link here. This is an optional link, not often a link. This is where someone's effort comes in, right? If they want to be top of their field, if they want to be the best at what they do, they should understand the literature. They should implement it directly into their practice. Guys, I hope this was clear. This little flow chart here. This is essentially how scientific papers, how an idea gets published, how it gets implemented into practice, right? The full A to B, right? A to Q or something. This is how it gets done. Obviously, you're far removed from the idea, from the hypothesis once you're in practice, right? Obviously, it's also not necessarily fair or reasonable to say that one should conduct their own scientific research as a practitioner. But the great philosophers back in the day, Hippocrates, Galen, if we're going to talk about the Western doctors who are fundamental in modern medicine and science nowadays, they were They were philosophers, they were mathematicians, they were scientists, right? They were researchers, they were gardeners, right? I'm sure they could build a house, right? A philosopher back in the day did it all, right? So if you want to hold yourself to a high standard, you should be doing it all. You should devote your life to learning and the truth. Yeah, I really think that's fundamental. This is what I'm trying to do, right? You know, you don't start your life off and become a doctor right away, right? That's not how it works. Be wary of young doctors, in my opinion. You know, they go through their training and stuff, but in my opinion, right, I trust an old dog all day, right? It's more likely that they've undergone some of this, that they know some of this, right? That they're more so of a true philosopher. You know, they should be well read in history and maybe even social issues, right? Economics, business. That's what a true philosopher is, I think. And a good doctor is a good philosopher in my mind, right? So it's important to understand all of this. I know I'm going on a little tangent here. I think it's important. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts down below. All the links down below. Follow me, subscribe, comment, review, whatever. I got a donation link down below. I don't like ads at all. I don't know if my YouTube videos have ads actually. Well, they're not monetized anyways. I'm not making any money off them yet. So I have a link down below if you guys want to donate. Everything's going to get reinvested into what I'm doing here. I really want to grow this. I love this. If I could do this full time, dedicate all my time to it, I would just be over the moon. That's my goal. I will achieve that goal. Obviously, it's just going to take some time. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Leave a like, subscribe. Thanks guys. Take care.